In a field haunted by wind and rattlesnakes, a 7-year-old girl runs in terror blood, soaking her knees as the hissing of death slithers behind. She was left to die by her own stepmother. But just as death drew near, a wild horse emerged like a ghost from another world. Its eyes saw straight into her pain. And from that moment, everything changed. Subscribe now to experience more soul-stirring cinematic storytelling films from us. Under the blistering blue dome of the Texas sky, the wind carved invisible pathways through Amarillo's vast, forgotten land. It was late morning, but the sun was already bleaching the rusty remnants of a long-abandoned horse training facility with a merciless glare. Sagebrushes bowed in the gusts, and dust swirled in little devils across the cracked earth, as if the land itself whispered secrets too old to matter anymore. From the horizon, 2 figures emerged in slow procession. A woman walking briskly in high-heeled boots, not meant for dirt, and a little girl trailing behind her, stumbling slightly in the uneven ground. Diane's lipstick was the same red as the blood of wild cherries. Her curls, tightly pinned under a felt sun hat, refused to move, even in the wind. She had dressed carefully for this, in pristine white linen and large sunglasses, more fitting for a gallery opening than the edges of nowhere. Every step she took stirred the earth into a puff, like she was walking away from something she didn't want to remember. Trailing her, Maddie walked like someone carrying a weight not her own. 7 years old, she wore denim overalls too big for her rolled at the cuffs and a faded white t-shirt with a peeling butterfly design. Her wide-brimmed straw hat shadowed her delicate face, but not enough to hide the wary set of her eyes. She clutched a red bandana balled tight in her fist. The edges were frayed. It had once belonged to her mother. The fabric was stained slightly, not with blood or grime, but with memory coffee lavender perfume. Tears dried long ago. She never let go of it. On days when no one was looking, she'd press it to her face and pretend her mother's voice was still trapped in the threads. The wind caught Diane's scarf and whipped it backward. She turned irritated and saw Maddie had lagged behind. Her painted nails curled into a fist. "Keep up, sweetheart," she called in a falsely bright tone, like someone performing for a hidden camera. Maddie said nothing. Her small boots kicked up dust as she tried to match Diane's pace. She glanced once over her shoulder. The car they'd arrived in, a sleek silver and air-conditioned, was parked a good 100 yards away, its doors shut tight. No sounds came from it. No sign of anyone else. "You said there'd be horses," Maddie said finally, her voice small and flat. Diane stopped walking and turned slowly. Her face wore the tight-lipped expression of someone holding back exasperation like smoke in a closed hand. "And there will be. Didn't I promise you a little cowboy adventure?" Maddie blinked at her. Her eyes were a deep amber brown. Old eyes for such a small frame. She nodded because she knew better than to question further. Questions led to silences, and silences led to sighs, and sighs led to locked bedroom doors. They resumed walking. The facility wasn't really a facility anymore. A wind-warped sign hung from one remaining gatepost. The paint bleached white, the letters faded until they were barely legible: Red Hollow Mustang Camp. Beyond the threshold lay a decaying skeleton of what once must have been a proud training ground. The fences had collapsed, the rails blackened by time. An old saddle rack leaned sideways, half swallowed by thorns. There was no sign of horses, no hoofprints, no hay, just wind. Maddie scanned the landscape. Something about it gnawed at her. It wasn't just the emptiness. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that made your bones stiffen, like something had been waiting here too long. "Why are there no other cars?" she asked. Diane didn't answer. Instead, she turned on her heel, walked to the back of the property, and pulled out a bag, an old plastic sack filled with discarded snack wrappers, half-empty water bottles, and a fast food container leaking grease. With a practiced flick, she tossed the bag into a dry patch of mesquite. Maddie stopped walking. "That's littering," she said softly. Diane glanced over her shoulder with a smile that never touched her eyes. "There's no one out here to care, darling." The red bandana in Maddie's hand crumpled tighter. She stared at the sack, its gaudy colors against the faded brush, like it was a wound opened across the land. Something about the way Diane threw it without a second glance sat inside her like a stone. That's how people did things, wasn't it? Discarded what was inconvenient. Threw away the things that no longer fit. Left them to rot under the sun. A gust of wind kicked up, carrying the sharp hiss of something sliding through grass. Maddie's head snapped around. She saw nothing. But she felt it an unease, like the ground itself was whispering to her to leave. "You said there'd be horses," Maddie said again, this time more firmly. Diane stopped in front of a rusted gate, pushed it open, and gestured grandly. "And here we are. Look around. This used to be the top training camp in northern Texas. Horses from this ranch were in movies parades, even rodeos. Can you imagine that? Maddie walked past the gate slowly. A broken sign swung from a chain. The wind slammed it once against the post, making a metallic clunk that echoed through the emptiness. I don't see any horses, Maddie said. They're in the far field, just past that rise. Diane pointed to a knoll in the distance where the grass grew taller, wilder, and more golden than green. The horizon shimmered with heat. Why don't you run ahead? Diane said. Her voice had that overly sweet tone again, like sugar just beginning to burn. See if you can spot any. I'll be right behind you. Maddie hesitated. The bandana trembled in her fist. You promised. I always keep my promises, baby girl. The moment hung between them like a thread. Maddie's eyes searched Diane's face for something truth-warmth, a crack in the facade, but all she saw was that same fixed smile, too smooth, too sharp. She turned and began to walk toward the rise. Each step sounded too loud in the quiet. Her boots scraped dry soil. Grass cracked underfoot. The air had changed. The wind felt wrong now, colder, even though the sun still blazed. She kept her eyes on the top of the hill. Past it, she told herself there would be horses. There would be saddles and reins and hay bales. There would be something. Behind her, Diane did not follow. Instead, she took out her phone, snapped a single photo of Maddie's retreating figure, tiny, vulnerable, and alone against the endless gold, and saved it in a folder marked Documents. Then she turned and walked the other way. At the crest of the hill, Maddie stopped. No fences, no stables, no horses, just wide open land and silence. She looked back. The gate stood still. Diane was gone. The camera pushed in on Maddie's face, slow and suffocating. Her breath caught. She looked down at the red bandana, then up at the empty horizon. The wind picked up again, whispering through the tall grass like it had something urgent to say. Then came the sound, soft, low, unmistakable. The warning rattle. Maddie froze. Somewhere nearby, coiled in the underbrush, a rattlesnake sang its mechanical lullaby. She took a step back. Another. The sound stopped. Then started again, closer this time. Her eyes darted. The landscape that once looked like golden wheat now seemed alive, crawling. Every branch could be a tail. Every rock could be eyes. Maddie clutched the bandana to her chest. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She dropped to her knees, breath shallow, and crawled backward, too afraid to run. Dust rose around her. From the shadows of an old fence, something stirred, but it wasn't a snake. A hoof, then another. A shape stepped forward, tall and ghostlike. A horse, burned umber coat streaked with white scars. One ear torn. Eyes dark as molasses, intelligent and still. Maddie's breath caught in her throat. The horse didn't move closer. It stood watching. She rose slowly, red bandana still clenched, and stared back. They stood that way. For a long moment, the girl and the horse, alone in a wasteland of memory and silence. Then, with a sudden gust of wind, the gate behind them slammed shut, and the screen cut to black. Under the punishing Texas sun, the land spread wide and desolate, scorched like parchment and whispering with secrets only the wind dared carry. Maddie stood alone now, her silhouette dwarfed by the crumbling bones of the red hollow Mustang camp. A place that once pulsed with life, now reduced to rust, dust, and rot. She stared at the sagging structure in front of her, a hollow barn with a roof caved in on one side, wood panels blackened from years of neglect. The air smelled of rust and heat, tinged faintly with something sharper. Something alive. Her hands trembled as she reached for the rusted latch of the stable gate. It groaned at her touch, swinging open with a screech that seemed too loud in the silence. Beyond it, the stalls lay open, empty. Cobs of old hay molded in the corners. Leather tack hung like forgotten ghosts. Broken reins curled like dead snakes on the ground. She stepped forward. One slow footfall, then another. Behind her, there was no sound. Diane was gone. Not just out of sight, gone. Maddie felt it like a sudden drop in pressure. Like oxygen had thinned around her and something thick and invisible had taken its place. She turned, half expecting to see the woman's silhouette at the top of the hill, maybe waving or calling her back. But there was only sun flare, heat distortion, and that endless mocking horizon. Diane, she called out, her voice swallowed immediately by the wind. No answer. Her grip tightened on the red bandana, fingers curling into the fabric until her knuckles went white. A fine layer of dust coated her lips. Sweat ran down the side of her face. The fear came on slowly, like a shadow rising under her skin. She took a step toward the barn again, hoping somehow there'd be someone inside. A worker, a stray horse, a soul. Anything. Then the sound came. It was faint at first, camouflaged in the rustle of dry grass. But her body recognized it before her mind did. A low, rhythmic clicking, mechanical, deliberate, ancient. The rattle. She froze, breath lodged in her throat. Her eyes darted across the tall golden grass. Nothing moved. But that didn't mean nothing was there. The rattling continued circling. It didn't sound close, but it didn't sound far either. The kind of sound that felt like it could leap 10 feet in an instant. Like death deciding whether to sleep or strike. Maddie's knees buckled slightly. She stepped back instinctively and slipped. Her boot caught on a vine of barbed wire buried beneath the grass. She tumbled backward, landing hard on the gravel. The air punched out of her lungs. Her elbow scraped the earth. Her right knee, already skinned from earlier, tore open again. Blood bloomed through the fabric like a flower unfurling. She whimpered, but that was all she allowed herself. One sound. She clamped her jaws shut, refusing to cry out. The rattle was louder now, closer. Maddie didn't know if it was one snake or several. The thought of multiple rattlers moving beneath the grass, slithering in shadows, made her stomach twist. She scrambled backward on her palms, dragging her injured leg through the dirt. The red bandana fell from her grasp, but she lunged for it, snatching it back like it was life itself. She pressed it to her knee, trying to staunch the bleeding. But the cloth was too small, too thin. Her blood seeped through, easily joining the ancient stains. Tears welled at the edges of her vision, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry. Not yet. Her breathing turned shallow, her chest tight. The air felt thinner by the second. The buzzing in her ears grew like pressure or panic. The ground was moving. Or maybe she was. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Her vision flickered, edges darkening, centers sharpening. The sound of the rattler blurred with her own pulse. And for a moment she thought the earth itself was hissing at her. Then, from somewhere beyond the broken fence, she heard something else. A voice, muffled, distant, coated in authority and ice. She crawled forward, pressing her body low to the ground until she reached the base of a split post. From here she could just make out Diane far across the field, standing beside the car, her phone pressed to her ear. She was talking fast, her posture relaxed. There was no panic in her movements, no urgency, just cold calculation. Maddie strained to hear. The wind made it difficult. But then, like fate itself wanted her to know, a sudden lull allowed the words to drift perfectly. Not ideal, but unavoidable, Diane was saying. She doesn't belong in the press photos. She doesn't match the image. A pause. She's got that Dust Bowl look. You know what I mean. Another pause. Yes, I know it's harsh. But voters don't like loose ends. She's not even mine legally. Her mother never updated the will. Maddie's breath hitched. She'll wander off. I've left her at Red Hollow. That place is a death trap anyway. Old fencing, venomous wildlife. They'll rule it an accident. Poor kid. Got lost playing cowgirl. The next thing Maddie heard was laughter. A dry, humorless chuckle that chilled her more than the snake ever could. She curled inward, her fingers digging into the dirt, the red bandana clutched in a death grip against her chest. The tears finally came silent, shameful. They trailed down her cheeks and fell onto the blood-streaked cloth, joining the history it carried. Blood, salt, loss. All this time, she had believed Diane didn't like her. But now she knew. Diane didn't see her. Not really. She saw a problem, a misfit, a complication to be solved. Discarded like the trash she'd flung into the field. Another hiss, this one closer. Maddie shot up, adrenaline overriding pain. She stumbled toward the barn, her vision doubling, legs trembling. Each step was a gamble. Each blade of grass could hide teeth. The barn door yawned open. She dove inside, slammed it shut behind her, and collapsed against it. Her chest heaved. The interior was dark, humid, thick with dust and silence. It smelled of old manure, dried leather, and rot. But it was empty, safe for now. She sat there, her back against the door, blood pooling under her thigh, and finally cried. Big, shuddering sobs that bent her little body in half. Through the slats in the door, light streamed in strips. Dust danced in the beams. A spider web shifted in the corner, its owner long gone. She unwrapped the bandana and looked at it. It was no longer red. It was maroon now, drenched in her blood, her tears, her truth. Something inside her cracked, not broke, cracked. And through the crack, something fierce crawled in. Something small, something quiet. But it burned like a match pressed to dry grass. Resolve. She wiped her face, tied the bandana around her wrist, and whispered into the dark barn. I see you now. And she didn't mean Diane. She meant the world. The lies. The system that lets someone like Diane make phone calls like that. That smiled at beautiful women with ugly intentions. That handed custody of a child to someone who saw her as an accessory until she wasn't convenient anymore. She stood, unsteady, shaking, but standing. Outside, the rattles started again. Inside, Maddie's eyes narrowed. Her lips parted just slightly. Come on then, because if this place wanted her dead, it would have to try harder. She wasn't going down like that. Not like something you toss in the weeds. Not like that. The light inside the barn shifted slowly. A dim haze pouring through the slats of sun-warped wood. Maddie lay curled in a patch of hay, her head resting against a beam that had half collapsed. Dust stuck to the blood on her knee. Her breath was shallow, ragged. The world beyond those walls sounded like it had gone quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects. Even the wind held its breath. But then faintly at first, like a memory crawling out from the corners of her mind, came a sound, a distant rhythm, low, steady, strange. Hooves. They echoed like thunder, muffled by time, growing nearer with each strike of hoof on hardpan earth. Not the clatter of domesticated trot, but something more primal, weighted, and unpredictable, as if the creature carrying it had long ago decided not to obey. Maddie stirred. Her body, exhausted and raw, didn't want to move. But something inside her, something deeper than thought, made her sit up, made her listen. The hooves stopped. A stillness followed. One that wasn't quiet but charged. Electric. She felt it on her skin like static. Every hair on her arms rose. And then came the breath. Not her own. A slow exhale, hot, heavy, ancient. Through a crack in this barn wall, she saw a shadow shift across the dirt. Massive. Solid. Fluid. It moved with the silence of a ghost and the presence of a storm. She crawled across the straw and pressed her face to the gap, her eye peeking through. It stood not 10 feet from the barn door. A horse? No, something wilder. A stallion, tall and muscular, its coat a deep brown laced with old scars, its mane a tangle of smoke and dust. The creature looked like it had stepped out of another time, half legend, half memory. Its eyes, dark as burnt molasses, shimmered with something old, something wounded. It wasn't tethered. No bridle, no saddle, no rope. It was free, and it had chosen to stop here. Maddie didn't breathe. The stallion didn't move. It stood there staring at the barn at her. Not blinking, not huffing, just watching. They stayed like that for what felt like forever. Two beings on opposite ends of heartbreak, peering through a veil neither had asked for. Maddie pressed her hand to the wood and slowly, carefully pushed the door open. It groaned, but the horse didn't flinch. She stepped out barefoot, bleeding, covered in dust. The wind lifted her hair. Her red bandana, soaked with her own blood, fluttered on her wrist like a warning flag. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The horse turned its head toward her ears, twitching once. It didn't rear. It didn't flee. Maddie stepped closer, limping. The horse lowered its head just slightly. A gesture so small, so subtle, it would have been missed by anyone not desperate enough to understand it. To Maddie, it meant everything. It was the same way her mother used to lean down when Maddie was upset. Not to speak. Not to fix. Just to say, I see you. The breath that tore out of Maddie's lungs wasn't a sob, but it could have been. Her knees buckled and she dropped into the dirt, eyes still locked on the horse. They stayed like that, stillness inside a storm. Then the stallion took a step forward, and then another. It approached her like the earth wasn't solid. Like it had learned to move without sound, without fear. When it was close enough to feel its breath against her face, Maddie didn't move. She let it sniff her skin, her cheek, her hair. The horse huffed once and pulled back, lifting its head. Maddie reached up. Her fingers brushed the scarred line along its cheek, soft, warm, alive. Her hand trembled. The stallion didn't pull away. That was all she needed. She stood slowly, painfully, and moved to its side. Her body ached, but her soul felt lighter. As if someone had finally said, "You're not alone," and meant it. She looked at the animal's back. It was tall, too tall, but something in her chest whispered you were meant to try. With every ounce of strength left in her, she climbed. Her hands clung to the wild strands of mane, and her bare foot found a groove in its flank. Her wounded leg screamed in protest, but she gritted her teeth and pulled. She slid once, almost fell, but the horse didn't move. It held still, like it understood this was more than a climb. It was a choice. Maddie scrambled up again, and this time she made it. When she finally settled on the stallion's bare back, she could hardly breathe. The horse shifted once beneath her, as if adjusting to her weight. Maddie leaned forward, pressing her cheek against its neck, her arms around its scarred body, like she was afraid it might vanish. The world spun. The wind howled, but she was still. There was no music, only breath, and heartbeat, and wind. And in that silence, something shifted. Maddie didn't know the stallion's name, but she whispered to it anyway. "Thank you." The horse turned slow and deliberate and began to walk. No bridle, no guide, just movement, as if it had always known where to go. They passed the broken fence. They moved past the barn. They stepped through the field where the snakes hissed and the world had turned its back. And Maddie, 7 years old, bleeding, broken, and brave, held tight to the one thing in her world that hadn't tried to leave her. They didn't speak, but they understood. One had once belonged to men who broke animals for glory, then abandoned them. The other belonged to no one, and now for the first time in both their lives, they belonged to each other. A trust born not from training, but from pain. Not from command, but from recognition. Far behind them across the hills, the wind carried the faintest echo of a voice. Diane realizing something was off, but it was too late. The storm had passed, and from its wake, a girl and a horse had found each other, two lost things, no longer alone. Night came down like a punishment. It didn't fall gently like in the city where light pollution softened every shadow. Here in the vast teeth of Amarillo's forgotten land, night snapped its jaws shut. Blackness fell hard and quick, swallowing the world whole. The stars above didn't twinkle. They burned silent witnesses to things they could not stop. Maddie lay curled on Blaze's back. Her arms looped around his scarred neck, her cheek resting against the coarse mane. Her knee throbbed. Her lips were cracked. Hunger curled inside her like a cold fist. But she didn't complain, didn't speak. She was learning to listen. Blaze stopped suddenly. Maddie's eyes fluttered open. Her body had drifted somewhere between sleep and fainting. She blinked into the darkness, disoriented. Blaze snorted once, then he stomped his left hoof sharply twice. Maddie sat up, gripping his mane tighter. Snake, that's what it meant. She didn't know how she knew, she just did. She looked around. The shadows trembled in the wind. But there it was, a whispering rustle to the right. Dry, dragging like scales through grass. Blaze turned his head and jerked it left. Maddie nodded. Okay, she whispered hoarsely. Left. He moved. The rhythm of his hooves was no longer random. It was language. Distant thunder cracked. Stormlight flickered along the edge of the clouds. Lightning like veins in the sky. The first drops came hours later. Cold. Relentless. They hit the dry earth like accusations. Maddie shivered. Blaze found shelter beneath a dead oak, its limbs twisted like old bones. Maddie slid off his back slowly, every movement deliberate. Her legs barely held her. She sat with her back against the trunk, wrapping her arms around her chest. The red bandana was tied above her wound, now soaked dark with blood and rain. The horse stood above her, unmoving. A sentry in the storm. She watched his eyes wide and alert, always scanning. His ears twitched like radar. She closed her own eyes and let the sound of the storm press into her. Wind, rain, hoofsteps, her breath, his. It reminded her of something. Flash, not lightning memory. A porch swing rocking. Her mother sitting beside her, soft hands braiding her hair. You don't always have to see things to know they're there, her mother said. Like what? Like change, like trouble, like someone lying. Listen to the wind. It'll always tell you. Tell me what? Her mother smiled and put a finger to her lips. Everything. The memory left as quickly as it came, pulled back into the darkness by the storm's howl. Lightning split a nearby tree with a sound like a gunshot. Maddie flinched, eyes snapping open. Blaze didn't move. The fire burned out by morning. They walked. No path, no destination, just forward. Sometimes the trail narrowed to snake-infested ravines. Sometimes the soil crumbled beneath Blaze's hooves, revealing sinkholes or the rusted steel teeth of long-abandoned traps from the ranch's glory days. Bait cages. Spring-loaded bear jaws. Blaze would stop, stomp once, tilt his head. Danger. Maddie began to understand. 1 stomp, eagles, watch your step. 2, eagles, we go around. A low grunt meant stillness. A head jerk left or right was a directional cue. They didn't speak, but they were no longer strangers. By the second night, Maddie could feel Blaze's breath pattern change when something spooked him. She learned to lean forward slightly when the terrain shifted under his hooves. She learned to loosen her grip when he moved fast and tighten it when his muscles braced. At one point, he suddenly backed away from a seemingly open clearing. Maddie's body tensed in sync with his. She looked down. There it was, a sunken patch of ground with bones scattered. Coyote, maybe deer. Predator territory. Blaze turned sharply and doubled back. They detoured 2 miles around. By the time the third dawn cracked the sky, Maddie was barely awake. Her lips were pale. Her limbs moved like water. Blaze trudged up the last slope of a low ridge, his legs covered in mud, his flanks heaving from fatigue. They crested the hill together, and then Maddie collapsed. She fell sideways, slipping off his back like a dropped scarf. Her body hit the dirt with a thud, limp and boneless. The bandana fluttered loose, landing beside her like a bloody flag. Blaze stood above her, snorted sharply, then pawed the ground. Twice. 3 times. He leaned down, nudged her with his muzzle. No response. He stomped again, harder. The wind picked up. From below the ridge on the far side of the hill, an old pickup truck rattled slowly up the trail. Its engine coughed. Smoke curled from the exhaust like ghosts. The truck came to a stop near a grove of old cedar trees. 2 figures stepped out. An elderly woman in a faded turquoise shawl and boots worn smooth with age. Her silver braid reached her waist. She carried a woven pouch and moved with a quiet dignity that suggested she'd been moving through these lands since before roads had names. The man beside her was older still, skin like tanned hide eyes, sharp beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He leaned on a carved walking stick, though there was power in his stance. He said nothing. They both saw the horse first, and then the child. The woman dropped her pouch and ran forward, kneeling beside Maddie. Her hands moved fast, checking pulse, lifting eyelids, brushing dust from the girl's face. "She's alive," the woman said. Her voice was gravel and comfort. The man approached slower, more cautious. His eyes never left Blaze. The horse had not moved. He stood guard, nostrils flaring, muscles tight. "Easy now," the man said, his voice like a distant drum. "We mean no harm." Blaze stamped once but didn't retreat. The woman Martha placed her palm gently on Maddie's chest, whispering something in a language the wind seemed to understand. The man Elias stepped forward and raised his hand to the horse. Blaze didn't flinch. He didn't move. Elias stopped 2 feet away. "I know you're kind," he murmured. "You ain't just running wild. You're carrying something." Blaze blinked once, then lowered his head. A nod, or something close to one. Martha scooped Maddie into her arms like she weighed nothing. The child's head lolled against her shoulder, her skin pale and lips cracked. Blaze followed as they walked to the truck. He didn't need reins, didn't need coaxing. He followed because he had delivered something precious, something broken. And he wasn't done yet. Inside the truck, Martha laid Maddie on a pile of blankets. Elias started the engine. Blaze trotted beside them as they rumbled down the trail, kicking up dust in the new morning sun. Martha looked down at the little girl in her lap. Fingers curled around the edge of a torn red bandana. A whisper of a voice, barely audible. "Did you hear the wind?" Martha didn't answer. She just brushed a piece of hair from the child's face and nodded once to no one in particular. "Yes," she whispered. "We heard." The old wooden cabin creaked with history. It stood in a hollow carved by time and wind, wrapped in the scent of cedar smoke and worn leather. Its timbers were gray and warped, patched with mismatched boards and rusted nails. But it breathed like something still alive, an old soul that refused to die. Inside, the walls were lined with blankets, stitched in tribal patterns. Faded photos of wild horses and shelves cluttered with glass jars full of roots, herbs, and dried plants tied with string. Everything smelled of earth and stories. Maddie lay on a cot in the far corner. Her limbs still weak, skin pale beneath the light. A woven quilt, hand-dyed in copper and blue, covered her small frame. Her eyes fluttered open to the sound of a wooden bowl being set on the table. Martha sat beside her, grinding something in a stone mortar. Her silver braid swayed down her back as she moved. Steam drifted from a pot of water on the stove, and the faint scent of sage yarrow and tobacco root filled the room. Maddie watched silently, lips pressed tight. "You're safe," Martha said, not looking at her. Maddie's hands tightened under the quilt. She glanced toward the door. "I want to leave." Martha didn't respond. She kept grinding. The rhythm of the pestle against stone was almost soothing. "I said I want to leave?" Maddie repeated louder now. "Then leave," Martha said, setting the bowl aside. "The door's not locked." Maddie blinked, but she didn't move. Instead, she stared down at the scar on her knee, now redressed with clean cloth and a paste that smelled bitter and strange. Her bandana had been washed, folded, and placed beside her, its color darker now, like blood aged by memory. Martha picked up a jar of honey and spooned a small amount into a tin cup, mixing it with warm water and a tincture. She handed it to Maddie. "It'll help with the pain." "I don't want anything from you," Maddie muttered. Martha raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm not your kind. Because I don't talk like your mother used to, or live in a house with polished floors and plastic fruit." Maddie didn't answer. She took the cup, sipped, winced. "Bitter," she said. "Truth always is," Martha replied. From the doorway, Elias leaned silently on his walking stick. His weathered face held no expression, but his eyes flicked from Maddie to the mare, standing outside the window. "Blaze hasn't moved since we brought her here," he said. Maddie corrected almost automatically. Elias's mouth curved faintly. Approval or amusement? It was hard to tell. "She's old," he continued. "Too old to carry you that far in weather like that." But she did. "She's not just a horse." "No, she's not." Silence settled again. Then Elias spoke, his voice quieter than before. Slower, like he was speaking across time. "Long before this land had fences, Red Hollow was sacred ground. It was a place where our people trained horses with breath, not rope. Where we spoke to them like family, not tools. Each horse had a name, a spirit, a story. And each child who came of age was matched with one based on dreams, based on signs." Maddie looked at him now. Elias's gaze drifted out the window. "Then came the men in trucks. They said we weren't certified, that our ways were dangerous. They bulldozed the stables, took the land, called it progress. We called it erasure. Martha handed Maddie a second cup, this one sweeter. Blaze was the last born before the raids. Her mother died in the roundup. We raised her ourselves. She ran away the night the last fence was cut. Never saw her again. Until you. Maddie stared out the window. Blaze stood still under a cottonwood tree. Her neck bowed as if listening to something only she could hear. But why me? Maddie asked. I'm nobody. Elias stepped forward. She didn't come because of what you are. She came because of what you carry. Maddie's fingers tightened around the cup. What I carry is nothing, she whispered. My stepmother says I don't belong anywhere. Martha walked to the window, pulled back the curtain. Did that horse look like she belonged anywhere? Maddie didn't answer. She carries ghosts, Martha said softly. Ghosts of children who never got to grow up. Of horses who were broken, then forgotten. Of voices erased from the history books. Elias lowered himself into a chair beside the fireplace. And now so do you. Maddie's voice cracked. She left me to die. Yes, Elias said simply. Maddie turned away, her breath shuddering. Her eyes stung with tears she didn't want to give. Martha sat back beside her. She didn't leave you because you were weak. She left you because you were strong enough to be inconvenient. Maddie looked at her, now really looked, and for the first time saw something familiar in the lines of the old woman's face. A shared shape of pain. Did they try to erase you too? Maddie asked. They still do, Martha said. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon like an old drum. Later that evening, when the sun dipped low and golden light spilled through the cracks in the walls, Maddie stepped outside. Her legs were still shaky, but she moved with quiet purpose. She walked barefoot across the dry dirt, her bandana clutched in her hand. Blaze lifted her head. They locked eyes again, horse and girl. Maddie stepped into the corral. No words. She reached up. Blaze didn't flinch. Maddie tied the red bandana gently around Blaze's neck, right over the old scar. It was a ceremony, a promise, one survivor to another. No dialogue, just wind, just breath, just understanding. And as the camera pulled back, the last light of the day bathed them both in amber. Two souls branded by the same fire, now walking through its embers together. The old television buzzed with static before the image locked into place. Inside the cabin, the black and white screen flickered, bathing the walls in pale light. The news anchor's voice was smooth, practiced, and urgent. And in a heartbreaking plea that has gone viral in the past 24 hours. Local philanthropist and political figure Diane Carrington is asking for the public's help in locating her missing stepdaughter, 7-year-old Madison Maddie Carrington, who vanished 2 days ago near the outskirts of Amarillo. The camera cut to Diane. She sat on a pristine white sofa dressed in soft gray silk, her hair styled just so. Lips pale with a gloss that shimmered like glass. The lighting was gentle on her skin, and the camera caught just enough of the trembling in her fingers to make the grief seem almost poetic. Her voice quivered as she spoke. If anyone has seen Maddie, please contact the sheriff's office. We just want her home. She's my family, my baby girl. A carefully timed pause, a hand pressed to her chest. I don't know how to sleep without knowing she's safe. The screen cut to a still image Maddie's school photo. Hair brushed, eyes bright, smiling. A number ticked across the bottom 1-800-TIP line. Social media is divided. The anchor continued, some praising Diane's bravery, others questioning her account. The sheriff's office has yet to comment. Maddie sat in the shadows of the cabin, knees pulled to her chest beneath Elias's old patchwork quilt. Her hair was tangled, her lips swollen, but her eyes were clear, clearer than they had been in days. She watched the screen like it was something poisonous. Blaze stood outside the window, half silhouetted against the early morning fog. Silent, still waiting. Martha turned from the stove, her hand gentle on Maddie's shoulder. You don't have to watch this. I want to. The video replayed Diane crying, voice-breaking hands twisting a silk handkerchief. She lies like she breathes, Maddie whispered. Martha sat beside her quiet. She didn't cry when she left me there, Maddie said. She didn't cry when the snakes came. Or when I screamed. She swallowed. But now she's crying on TV. Martha reached across and turned the volume down, letting the hum of the outside world fade. Some people build their whole lives on pretending, she said. They get so good at it, they start to believe it themselves. I don't want her to pretend anymore. Then stop letting her. Maddie looked up. What? Silence is her armor, Martha said. She wears it so people only see what she wants them to see. But your voice, that's the blade. The only thing that cuts through lies is truth spoken out loud. Maddie stared at the screen. And in that moment, the silence inside her broke like glass. I want to tell them, she said. Martha raised an eyebrow. Tell who? Everyone. The whole town. I want to stand in front of all of them and say it. Say what she did. Say what she left me to die in. Martha smiled, soft, proud. Elias stood by the door, arms crossed. You'll need proof, he said. I have scars. They won't be enough for people like her. I have Blaze, Maddie said, and I have this. She held up the bandana, torn, stained. It looked like something pulled from a battlefield. She left me with nothing. Maddie said, standing now, trembling with a rage that was old and pure. But I'm still here. She pulled the quilt off her shoulders and let it fall. The fire inside her was brighter than anything on screen. I want to ride into town, she said. Not hide out here. Not wait. I want them to see me, the real me. Martha reached for her boots. Then let's get you ready. Outside, the morning fog was peeling back like theater curtains. Blaze stood waiting at the fence, her eyes steady. Maddie stepped into the light barefoot in the red dirt. Her arms were scraped, her clothes ragged, but her spine was straight and her jaw was set like stone. She walked to Blaze and placed a hand on the mare's chest. You carried me out of hell, she whispered. Now let's ride into it. Elias emerged from the shed with a saddle carved with old tribal markings. This belonged to my sister, he said. She was the first woman in our tribe to ride in the parade of flags. You honor her by carrying this. Maddie looked him in the eye. I'll carry all of them. Martha tied the red bandana around Maddie's upper arm, the cloth wrapping like a badge. No more hiding, she said. No more hiding, Maddie repeated. The sun broke through the clouds, then slicing gold across the land. Maddie climbed onto Blaze's back higher this time, stronger. And with a small nudge, they were off down the dirt road, wind in her hair, the red bandana flapping like a warning. Back in town, the local square buzzed with reporters and whispers. Diane stood beside a deputy rehearsing concern. Any updates from search and rescue? None yet, ma'am. She sighed dramatically. Then she heard it, the thunder of hooves. It cut through the air like judgment. All heads turned. Blaze galloped into the square dust, trailing behind her like smoke. Maddie sat tall on her back hair, wild eyes blazing. Gasps. Cameras clicked. Diane's mouth opened, closed. Maddie pulled the horse to a stop, dead center. No one spoke. She dismounted slow and deliberate and walked forward. No shoes, dirt-caked legs. A child from the wilderness, a child reborn. I'm Maddie Carrington, she said. The microphones leaned in. And I'm not missing. I was left. People froze. Diane stepped forward, trembling. Sweetheart, you must be confused. No, the word struck like a slap. You left me in that field, with snakes, with no food, with no way back. Gasps, murmurs. Diane's face turned white. You went on TV and cried, but you never cried for me, not once. A reporter pushed forward. Maddie, are you saying your stepmother? She tried to erase me, Maddie said. Because I didn't fit in her picture? Because I'm not perfect? Because I'm not hers? She turned to the crowd. But I'm still here. And I remember everything. Elias and Martha arrived on foot, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. Ask her where she was when I almost died, Maddie said. Ask her what she did with the inheritance from my mom. Ask her why she told the lawyer I wasn't worth the trouble. Diane tried to speak, tried to cry, but the crowd had already started to shift. Cameras pivoted, not toward Diane, toward Maddie, toward truth. Maddie stepped back, lifted her bandana. This is the blood she didn't want to see. The truth she tried to bury. Then she climbed back onto Blaze, turned the horse, and rode. Not away, but forward, through the center of town, through the middle of every lie, and into something no one could silence. Not anymore. The sun spilled gold across the plains. It was late afternoon in Amarillo, and the sky burned amber. Shadows stretched long across the fairgrounds as the annual Wild West Heritage Festival bloomed to life, bunting flapping in the wind, banjos ringing over loudspeakers, cowboy hats bobbing in a sea of denim and boots. The air was thick with roasted corn, sweet tobacco, and anticipation. Children ran between booths, painted with faded murals of longhorns and frontier trains. On the main dirt arena, hay bales ringed the performance space. Speakers crackled as the announcer's voice, low and syrupy, greeted the growing crowd. And at sunset, don't miss the Legacy Ride, where riders of all generations remind us what it means to be Texan. Behind the noise, away from the ribbon tents in a quiet patch of pasture behind the barns, Maddie was riding in circles, her legs gripped tight around Blaze's flanks, her posture straight, her eyes forward. Each breath was measured, each movement studied. Martha clapped once from the fence. Again, Maddie leaned, guiding Blaze into a wide turn. The horse responded like muscle to thought fluid exact. Dust kicked up behind them, a cloud of memory in motion. You're holding too much tension in your wrists. Elias called from under the shade of a live oak. The horse moves from your spine. Let your arms breathe. Let your arms. Maddie adjusted. Her bare arms glistened with sweat, her cheeks streaked with dirt. Her bandana, washed clean, then tied again, fluttered around her neck. Martha walked out into the circle and handed her something small, heavy, and smooth. It was her mother's old concho belt buckle, polished with oil in years. The silver was faded, but the engraving still clear, a rose caught in flame. She wore this when she rode in the parade, Martha said. Tied it over her waist and said, "Let them see who I really am." Maddie took the buckle and nodded. "I want them to see too." And when the bells rang for sunset, Maddie and Blaze stood at the edge of the arena, hidden behind the open gate, waiting. Inside, the festival had swelled. Hundreds filled the bleachers. Vendors paused at their stalls. Even the sheriff sat upright in his seat. Music rolled through the speakers, an old fiddle tune, slow and rising. The announcer cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time in more than a decade, we welcome back a legacy rider from the lost traditions of Red Hollow Ranch, the last mare of the old bloodline, and the youngest rider to ever enter this arena." A pause. Then, Maddie Carrington and Blaze. The crowd didn't clap at first, because they didn't understand. But when Maddie appeared riding tall and proud, her red bandana flaring in the wind, her eyes lit by something untouchable, they did. Applause erupted like gunfire. Blaze broke into a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop, her hooves drumming against the earth like war music. Maddie leaned low, hair whipping across her face. One hand on the reins, one hand raised high, fingers curled like she was reaching for something just beyond the air. Every pair of eyes followed her, including Diane's. She stood frozen at the edge of the arena, surrounded by city officials and TV crews. Her makeup immaculate, her pearls gleaming. Until now, the moment she saw Maddie, her breath caught. She took a step forward, lips parting. "No." Blaze turned sharply at the arena's edge, kicking dust straight at the press box. Cameras flashed. Children pointed. "Is that the girl someone whispered?" "That's the missing girl. That's Maddie." Diane turned in a slow circle as the crowd murmured louder. The sheriff stood, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. A woman near the front row rose to her feet. "That's the child you said was gone." Diane tried to respond. I didn't." The woman raised a hand. Why is she riding like she owns the sky if she was so broken and lost? The crowd began to shift. Like a tide turning, a man from the feed store crossed his arms. "Funny how you never mentioned horses when we searched. Just scrubland." Another woman, eyes rimmed with mascara, clutched her chest. "She looks like she's been through hell." "That's not a runaway." Diane backed away. Cameras swiveled to her. Questions barked from reporters. "Did you abandon her? Did you lie to investigators? Why didn't you mention Red Hollow Ranch?" Maddie completed her final lap and pulled Blaze to a stop in front of the grandstand. She dismounted with grace beyond her years and walked forward. Her boots hit the dirt with soft, deliberate impact. She looked straight at Diane, then spoke. "I came back." Silence. "I came back because I didn't want to be quiet anymore." The mic was pushed toward her. "She left me in a place where people used to throw away things they didn't want. She told me we were going to see horses, but she meant for me to disappear." She turned to the sheriff. She said I didn't belong in her picture. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She said no one would miss me. The sheriff removed his hat. The crowd leaned in. Maddie raised her chin. "But I survived. And now I'm riding." She placed her hand on Blaze's shoulder. "She's the last horse from Red Hollow. She remembers everything. And so do I." Diane tried one last time. "Maddie, sweetheart." The child's eyes narrowed. "Don't call me that." A beat passed, and then the first person clapped. Then another, and another, until the whole town stood not just for Maddie, but for the truth, for survival, for voices that refused to stay buried. Diane turned away and melted into the crowd, no longer applauded, no longer untouchable. Maddie stood still, until Martha and Elias appeared behind her, hands resting gently on her shoulders. And then Blaze nuzzled her side. 3 generations, 3 survivors, under the bleeding orange sky. The camera faded to black as music swelled not from speakers, but from the people, from the land, from something reclaimed. And not even the dust could hide the fire still burning in Maddie's eyes. The town square had transformed. Gone were the carnival lights and celebratory fanfare. Now the wooden platform at its center served as an open-air courtroom. Folding chairs lined the perimeter, filled with townspeople in denim and sweat-stained collars, their faces stiff with curiosity, suspicion, and something quieter guilt. Above them, the courthouse clock ticked loudly, slicing the silence into seconds too long to endure. Maddie sat alone at the long table in front of the crowd. Her feet barely touched the ground. A bandage peeked out from under her sleeve, her red bandana tied tight around her arm. Her face was clean, but her hair still wild. Untamed. Truthful. Across from her sat Diane Carrington, immaculate in black. A modest mourning dress, pearl earrings, her hands folded in her lap like a grieving widow at her own redemption. She spoke first. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice calm, practiced. "What happened to Maddie is a tragedy. I'm just grateful she's home." A murmur passed through the crowd. "She's confused," Diane continued, "traumatized. You've all seen how trauma can alter memory. My stepdaughter isn't lying. She's afraid. And fear makes stories." Maddie didn't flinch. "She believes I left her," Diane said. "But it isn't true." She wandered. She got lost. She turned to the crowd. Children do that. A heavy pause. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods lining the street. Then Maddie stood. She said nothing. Not at first. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded something slowly, deliberately. A square of faded red cloth still stained with brown around the edges. She held it up. This, she said quietly, was around my knee the day she left me. The sheriff stepped forward to examine it. A hushed silence fell. She gave me nothing else, Maddie said. No water, no food. Just this and the sound of her car driving away. Diane's lips parted. Maddie turned towards the crowd. She says I'm confused, that I imagined it. A pause. She reached into her second pocket. And if you think I'm imagining this? She handed Elias a small thumb drive. He stepped forward, nodding once at the sheriff, and plugged it into a laptop connected to a monitor facing the crowd. A grainy video appeared, timestamped 2 days prior. The view was low-angled through tall grass taken from Elias's motion sensor wildlife cam mounted along an old trail. The lens shook slightly with wind. Then movement. A silver SUV pulled into the clearing. Diane stepped out, opened the back door. Maddie emerged wearing the same red bandana, clutching her mother's old backpack. They spoke. No audio, just body language. Maddie pointed at the trail, confused. Diane pointed the opposite direction, then gently pushed Maddie toward the brush. Then she turned, got back into the SUV, drove away. Gasps rippled through the square. Elias paused the video. No one spoke. Not even Diane. She didn't forget me, Maddie said. She planned it. Stillness. Until a new voice spoke. Young, steady, sharp as fresh steel. Your Honor, if I may. From the edge of the crowd stepped a woman in a tailored jacket and worn cowboy boots. Her dark curls were pinned up and a folder clutched in her hand. Name, the sheriff asked. Olivia Reyes, she said. Attorney, independent witness. Diane's face twitched. I've reviewed Maddie's story. The footage, the blood-stained item, the historical records from Red Hollow. I've reviewed it all. She turned toward the crowd, but I didn't need all that to believe her. She walked slowly to the center of the space, her boots thudding softly against the wood. You want evidence because it's hard to accept that someone who smiles like that, she pointed gently toward Diane, could leave a child to die. Gasps. Diane stood. Objection, this isn't a courtroom. No, ma'am, Olivia said, calm. This is something much harder. This is your community deciding if the story it tells about itself is worth anything at all. She stepped beside Maddie. I know what it's like to be a kid who's thrown away, she said louder now. I was one. Foster care at 6, a dozen homes. I learned early how to smile so no one asked questions. She looked out at the crowd, because the question was always the same. What did you do to deserve being abandoned? A beat of silence. Then Olivia's voice cracked, not from weakness, but from fury choked for years. But children don't have to deserve anything to be loved. They don't have to earn safety, or food, or kindness. Her voice grew stronger. They have the right to survive. Without being pretty enough, quiet enough, useful enough. She turned toward Diane. You tried to erase her. The words dropped like lead. You tried to dress it up in tears and lace and morning news segments. But what you did was attempted erasure of her pain, her body, her memory. Diane's hands began to shake. I didn't. You left her in a killing field. The crowd held its breath. And then you called it parenting. Maddie sat back down. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes softened. Because for the first time, she wasn't holding the truth alone. The sheriff turned to Diane. We'll need a formal statement. Come with me. Diane didn't move. A woman from the bakery stepped forward. Then the school principal. Then 2 ranch hands. They surrounded Diane, not to touch, not to threaten, but to look. And in their eyes was something harder than hate. Recognition. The kind that saw through Sunday dresses and perfect smiles. The kind that said, we let this happen. Maddie stood slowly. Blaze waiting behind her in the shade saddle, gleaming unshaken. The wind picked up again. This time the red bandana lifted, not like a relic, but like a flag. Of resistance. Of survival. And for the first time, the town square didn't feel like a stage. It felt like a reckoning. The sirens didn't wail. When Diane Carrington was placed into the back of the sheriff's cruiser, the only sound was the wind brushing through mesquite trees and the distant shuffle of horses in their stalls. She didn't cry, didn't shout, just sat there, eyes hollow, as the door clicked shut and the engine pulled away from the square like a chapter finally closed. The townspeople didn't cheer. They watched, silently. Because what had just happened wasn't about victory. It was about recognition, about how long it had taken for them to look beneath her silk blouses and curated tears to see what she'd left behind in the dirt. Across the square, Maddie stood beside Blaze, one hand resting on the mare's neck. Her eyes followed the car until it disappeared behind the cottonwoods, then dropped slowly to the ground. Elias approached first. You did more than speak, he said. You changed the story. Maddie didn't answer. Just leaned into Blaze's shoulder, burying her face into the warmth of the horse's hide. She stayed that way for a long while. No one moved to pull her away. Later, in the quiet glow of the ranch house kitchen, Maddie sat at the wooden table as Martha set a steaming bowl of stew in front of her. Outside, the sun had begun to dip, painting everything in hues of bronze and blue. "I spoke with the counselor from Austin," Martha said softly. "They want you to come back. They say you'll be safe now." Maddie stirred the soup once, twice. "I don't want to go back," she said. "Are you sure?" Martha asked. Maddie looked up, her eyes calm, clear. "There's nothing left for me there. Not really." Elias sat down across from her, chewing on a toothpick. "You don't have to decide tonight." "I already did," Maddie said. Her voice wasn't defiant. It was resolved. She stood up from the table, walked to the screen door, and looked out into the dusk. Blaze stood in the field alone, the silhouette of the red bandana tied gently around her neck, catching the last light. It fluttered in the breeze, not as a ragged wound, but as a flag. A symbol. A promise that the past hadn't broken her, that it had transformed her. Weeks passed. The story made the news for a few days. Talk shows, podcasts, online outrage. But like all headlines, it faded. The world moved on. But Maddie didn't. She stayed. Each morning she rose before the sun and helped Elias feed the horses. She learned how to change shoes, how to braid manes, how to clean saddles, and whisper to colts that bucked harder than they should. Martha taught her how to grind medicine from tree bark and find water in dry soil. Blaze followed her everywhere. They no longer needed reins. One movement, one breath, one glance. That was all it took. In late spring, Martha opened the gate to the ranch. She invited the town, and the children came. Some came with nervous hands and loud questions. Others stood back, afraid of the horses' power, unsure of their own. Maddie was the one who approached them. She didn't teach them how to ride like riders. She taught them how to listen. "Don't pull the reins," she told one boy. "Just look where you want to go." "Won't they ignore me?" he asked. She shook her head. "They hear with more than ears." Another girl asked, "What if they don't like me?" Maddie knelt beside her. "Then you sit still until they do. You don't force it. You feel it." The children watched her ride Blaze bareback across the paddock, her hands out to the sides, her bandana now clean, bright flying like a ribbon behind her. And slowly, one by one, they began to climb into the saddles. They dropped their fears like old coats and let the wind teach them something school never did. Not control, but connection. One afternoon, a city worker arrived at the ranch. He carried a clipboard and wore a badge that said, "Child Welfare Liaison." He asked to speak with Maddie. "I just need to know your plan," he said gently. "We're here to protect you. But the law still wants a record? A choice." Maddie nodded. "I want to stay here," she said. The man blinked. "You're sure?" She pointed to the barn, to the land, to Blaze, to Martha and Elias. She paused. "To me." He scribbled something on his form. "Well, all right then," he said, almost smiling. The day the state sent confirmation, a letter arrived in a plain white envelope. Inside was a single page confirming Maddie's placement with her new guardian's full guardianship pending final review. Maddie hung the paper above her bed. Next to it, she pinned a photograph, Blaze mid-gallop red scarf streaming like wildfire, and Maddie laughing. Unposed, unbroken. That evening, the town hosted a bonfire in the wide field near the edge of the canyon. It wasn't a festival. It wasn't a trial. It was just a gathering. Elias played an old harmonica. Martha stirred a pot of beans over an open flame. Children ran barefoot, their laughter echoing into the hills. Maddie sat beside Blaze at the fence watching. A little girl approached her shyly. "Can I ride her?" the girl asked. Maddie looked at Blaze, then back at the girl. "Not tonight," she said, smiling. "But maybe soon." The girl nodded and ran off. Maddie reached up and touched the scarf tied around Blaze's neck. She thought about where it had started. A wound, a binding, a lifeline. And now here it was something else entirely. It was a banner, not just of survival, but of choice. Of reclaiming the right to be more than what the world allowed. As the fire cracked and sparks floated into the night sky, Maddie closed her eyes. Not to forget, but to remember everything she was now free to carry. On her terms. On this land, with this horse. And the wind for the first time didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like home. The arena lights came up like sunrise. Not the kind that burned, the kind that warmed. The seats were packed. Children, parents, counselors, volunteers. Rows and rows of quiet faces, some scarred by things the world never saw. Others still too young to name their pain. But all watching. And then from the far gate 2 figures appeared. One on 4 legs, steady and ageless. One on 2, small but unshaken. Blaze trotted forward, and on her back rode Maddie Carrington, no longer the girl lost in a Texas field. She wore a denim shirt rolled at the sleeves, leather chaps stitched by hand, and the red bandana tied proudly around her upper arm, not as armor, but as a banner. Her hair was loose behind her, her smile soft but real. When she reached the center of the arena, she raised her hand. Blaze stopped instantly, a beat of silence. Then Maddie looked up at the crowd and spoke not loudly, but with absolute clarity. "My name is Maddie," she said, "and this is Blaze. We ride together not because we were trained the same way, but because we survived the same thing." Silence. I used to be afraid of everything. Of the wind, of the dark, of people smiling when they didn't mean it. She looked at a young boy in the front row, whose arms were covered in long sleeves, despite the summer heat. But Blaze didn't run from me. She saw me. Maddie paused, and when someone sees you, even just once, you learn how to start seeing yourself. Blaze pawed the ground once. Maddie smiled. "That's why we started this. To help you feel what I felt the first time she let me ride. Not power, not control, but trust." Behind her, a banner stretched across the back wall. "Horses and Hope, a Maddie Carrington program." And below that, the segment aired nationwide the following week. Shot in soft golden tones and narrated with reverence, it played across televisions and tablets with a quiet kind of impact. The footage began with Maddie in the training ring teaching a little girl how to rest her cheek against a horse's neck. "She hasn't spoken in weeks," a counselor whispered off camera. "But with the horse, she hums." Cut to Blaze guiding the young boy with a leg brace through his first lap on horseback. He cried after the dismount, not from pain, but from something bigger than relief. Maddie watched him go, with that same calm she had learned under sun and silence. The narrator's voice came next. Once discarded like dust in the wind, Maddie Carrington now rides at the front of a growing movement, teaching children who've known abandonment that healing doesn't come through force, but through listening, presence, and trust. In partnership with horse sanctuaries across the Southwest, her program, Ngua Va Nim Tin, brings survivors and horses together, not for spectacle, but for restoration. And at only 9 years old, Maddie has become the youngest registered equine trauma response facilitator in the state of Texas. The recognition wasn't what changed her. It was the faces, the letters, the names. A girl in New Mexico who sent a drawing of Blaze with wings. A boy in Missouri who signed his thank you card, "Your brother in strength." A foster mom in Oklahoma who wrote, "He won't let me hug him, but he sleeps holding a photo of you and the horse." Those were the moments that made her saddle up again. Not the awards, not the headlines. One night under a Colorado sky, Maddie sat at the edge of a horse barn, surrounded by mountains. She looked out at the sleeping tents of the children who had come through that week's clinic. The fires had burned low. The stars shivered in the cold air. Martha sat beside her, wrapping a shawl over her own shoulders. Elias leaned against the post, watching Blaze graze in the distance. "You've made something, girl," Martha said. Maddie shook her head. "She made it," she whispered, nodding toward Blaze. "I just held on." Elias chuckled. "You did more than hold on. You turned a ghost into a guide." Maddie looked down at her hands. They weren't the hands of a child untouched. There were calluses now, scars, strength. "She used to carry me," Maddie said. "But now, it feels like we carry each other." Martha reached over, brushing hair from her face. "You carry more than just each other." At the Texas State Fair later that year, Maddie and Blaze were the final act. No music, no announcer, just silence. And when they entered, the crowd fell into reverent hush. Blaze walked slow, deliberate. Maddie stood barefoot on her back, arms out like wings, the red bandana tied around Blaze's neck. She didn't do tricks, didn't need to. She just stood there, letting the horse walk the full arena with the wind in her face, the past behind her, and nothing in front of her but future. When they stopped at the center, Maddie knelt and laid a hand against Blaze's heart. Then she whispered, "You brought me home." And for every child who watched from the shadows that day, something shifted, because they knew she didn't mean a place. She meant herself. She had come home to herself. And from that place, she built something for others to return to. Not a shelter, not a school, but a language made of hooves and hands and breath and belief. A language of survival and trust and quiet, relentless hope. The wind had returned to Red Hollow. It came in slow, curling gusts that stirred the tall grass like a breathing ocean. The golden hour fell heavy over the plain, casting long shadows and washing everything in the warm, quiet light that only arrived when the world had nothing left to prove. Blaze stood still in the center of the open field. Her body carried time. Now her coat no longer the unbroken sheen of youth, but dappled with silver around the muzzle, softened at the edges. But her posture was the same proud, alert, unmovable. The red bandana still hung around her neck, faded and frayed at the seams. It didn't look like cloth anymore. It looked like memory. Across the field came Maddie, 15 now, taller, stronger, but not hardened. Her eyes still held that quiet fire, the kind that didn't burn for vengeance, but for something deeper, something steadier. She wore a weathered riding jacket stitched with patches from every clinic she and Blaze had led: New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona. Each square of cloth a story, a life touched, a voice found. In her hand she held a letter. She stopped just short of Blaze and unfolded the paper, its edges soft with handling. She began to read, silently at first, then aloud, just above a whisper, her voice trembling only at the edges. "Dear Maddie, I don't know if you remember me, My name is Eliza. I came to the Nguava Neem tin camp in Nevada last spring. I was the girl who wouldn't take off her hoodie. I didn't talk the first 2 days. You never made me. You just let me watch blaze. On the third day, she let me brush her mane. I still remember the way she breathed through her nose like she was telling me I was okay, even if I didn't say anything back. It was the first time I felt seen in a long time. At night, I used to cry into my pillow so no one would hear. But that night, I didn't cry. I just held on to the horsehair you gave me, and it felt like I wasn't alone. I went home, and a few months later, my mom got out of rehab. She's clean now. We're in a better place. We even started volunteering at a rescue shelter. We don't talk about the bad stuff much. But I told her about you. I told her how you weren't afraid to ride straight into silence. How you didn't need to explain yourself to be understood. And how Blaze never flinched. I don't have many heroes, but you are mine. You taught me something I didn't know I needed to hear. Not everyone who leaves you behind wins. Eliza, age 12. Maddie's fingers tightened around the paper knuckles white. She lowered it slowly, then folded it back into a perfect square. She didn't wipe the tears from her face. She let them sit there quiet and earned. Then, with a breath caught between memory and motion, she walked to Blaze and leaned in, pressing her cheek against the mare's neck. The warmth there was steady, the heartbeat slow and certain. No words, none needed. The sky deepened behind them. Clouds like brushstrokes swept across the horizon. A few sparrows darted through the air, their wings carving silence. And Blaze turned her head, looked west, into the setting sun, as if she saw something no one else could. As if the past no longer weighed on her spine. Only the wind moved now. It wrapped around the field, lifting the edge of Maddie's jacket and tugging gently at the bandana. The red scarf rose into the air just slightly. It rippled once, twice, and then flew. For a moment it danced in the fading light, not like blood, but like freedom, not like pain, but like story. The frame widened, Maddie and Blaze side by side, standing at the edge of everything they had survived. Still breathing, still together. And as the light faded into dusk, so did the sound, until all that remained was wind and breath, and something unspoken. Fade out.